Tēnā koutou, everyone, and welcome to the Lessons from the Scottish Water Reform session. So it's my pleasure to introduce Alan Sutherland, the Chief Executive of the Water Industry Commission for Scotland. There's always things that you can learn from other places and other people, and when it comes to water reform, Scotland has walked that path before us. So you may have also noted that Alan wrote an opinion piece in our October edition of InfoRead, where he discusses economic regulation, and it's titled Holding the Three Waters for Thought. So if you haven't read that, I'll encourage you to go and look at it. So since his appointment in 1999, Alan has driven substantial improvements in efficiency and service for Scotland's water and wastewater customers. He also put in place a competitive non-household retail market in 2008, a world first at the time, unswervingly committed to a customer-centric approach. Alan is working with sector stakeholders to engender greater candour, transparency and collaboration. This approach will help Scottish Water to meet the challenges for the future that it faces, including climate change. Alan believes in sharing experiences and expertise, and through the Scottish Government's Hydro Nation initiative supports international capacity building projects that facilitate the development of economic regulation and of more sustainable water industries. Alan's previous roles were in management consultancy and the investment banking industry. So I welcome Alan here this morning.
Thank you, Claire, and good morning to everyone. Thanks for inviting me to join you. It's been great getting to know some of you since I first came to New Zealand and visited New Zealand in 2018. As Claire said, I've been the economic regulator of the water industry in Scotland for the last 22 years. Unlike in England and Wales, the industry is very firmly rooted in the public sector, and that was one of very many reasons why water reform for a long time in Scotland was really very, very controversial. So I'm very well aware of what people are saying and thinking in New Zealand, but I can assure you that in Scotland it was probably almost every bit as controversial as what's happening with you just now. So what is economic regulation as a first question? If you think proactive ex-ante audit, and then you add a shed load of details, so that's really it. Done appropriately, economic regulators are pretty blunt people. We don't pull punches. We say what the analysis says it says. So we're never terribly popular. We're not necessarily the most interesting. Usually we're regarded with suspicion. But here's my first sort of thought for you, and it comes from Robert Burns, our national poet. Robert Burns said, "Suspicion is a heavy armour, and with its weight it impedes more than it protects." Now, with that introduction, you might want to press the mute button, but for those of you who carry on. So let's start with a question for you. What is the furthest city airport from Edinburgh in Scotland? Anywhere on the planet? You could maybe try and answer it. No looking it up. There's a website that will tell you. So what about the work we've been doing in New Zealand? So colleagues with myself from WICS coordinated an information request on behalf of the Department for Internal Affairs, with regard to the request for information, or RFI. This information collection from New Zealand seemed large to many, but it was a small subset of what we collect every year from Scottish Water. Just for example, we didn't collect detailed information on customers, on tariffs, on proposed investment projects. Nor did we ask for the kind of detailed commentaries on that information that Scottish Water has to provide. And it's these commentaries that are really critical to an economic regulator, because they're what build confidence around the integrity of the numbers provided. So it's going beyond audit, right? It's going for audit plus explanation and quantification. So the commentaries are basically have to explain how a company sourced the information, why the numbers might differ from those in a previous report, and what the impact of that would be on customers. So our analysis for the potential of a well-implemented, and I stress well-implemented, Three Waters reform in New Zealand was based on the information that we received in the RFI. It's also based on comparisons with what private, not-for-profit, and publicly owned companies in Great Britain have delivered. Now, I absolutely understand that holding the mirror up in this way is never going to be very popular. And when I did this more than 20 years ago in Scotland, I can assure you it really wasn't very popular with us either. Yet only 8 years after I first did that, the industry in Scotland had proved itself and me wrong by performing better than I'd originally said. So this basically brings me to what I'd like to focus on, the main building blocks to getting things right. And in doing so, making the most of what seems to me to be pretty much a once in a lifetime opportunity for infrastructure. But before I start, I'd just like to take a couple of minutes to talk about what I see as being the prize and talk about the transformation that we've been through in Scotland. Some of this might already be familiar to some of you, and so if it is, then sorry. But I do think it sheds some light on the potential for what could happen in New Zealand. Now, hopefully this slide tells the picture quite well. When Scottish Water was first formed in 2002, so about 3 years after I was appointed, from 3 separate water authorities with very distinct geographical areas, it was by some distance the poorest performer in Great Britain. It was very inefficient. Poor customer service and sketchy management information were the reality that we were all dealing with. In the 20 years since then, it's now transformed itself to being one of the best utilities in the UK. And it's not me just saying that, that's independent observers are saying that. So for example, the Institute of Customer Service, which covers all sectors in the UK, said that recently that Scottish Water was the 9th best performing company in the UK across all service sectors for its service to customers. And in that time, its operating costs and its capital expenditure unit costs have fallen by over 40%. It's invested over $25 billion to meet demanding toll legislation and maintain levels of service. And it's those efficiencies that have allowed household bills to see a real reduction in the period after 2002, which compares with some quite heady increases prior to that. So my sense, based on this analysis that we've done of information that came directly from councils, audited information from councils, is that a similar opportunity exists in New Zealand. And it wouldn't actually surprise me if New Zealand is able to do better than we say, because Scotland learned from England and Wales and went further and faster, and ultimately now is doing better than England and Wales. This is information, this assessment is, as I said, based on the information provided by councils. I'm told that this data collection exercise was the largest ever undertaken. But I stress again, it's a subset of what an economic regulator will need to collect on an ongoing basis. And just to be very clear, our analysis of potential efficiencies and future investment required is based on a series of econometric and unit cost models that take into account asset bases, topography, geography, and customers served. And these models have been used in a variety of jurisdictions in Europe, in Australia, and now in New Zealand. And they incorporate information from each of those geographies. We also sought to allow for any factors that could increase expected costs in New Zealand, but, and this is important, we took no account of any factors that are already acting in favour of New Zealand industry, such as, for example, employer-owned costs being much lower in New Zealand than they are in Great Britain. I understand absolutely that many dispute the modelling. They did too in Scotland. In fact, consultants used to make quite a lot of money out of disputing the models. And similarly, they did that in England as well. They disputed them. So as an economic regulator, what I'd actually say to you is I'd be kind of disappointed if they didn't. Because if they didn't, then probably I'm not holding the mirror up well enough and I'm not showing enough about what could be achieved. Now, if you're asking me, will the modelling be absolutely right? I'll say, no, it'll be absolutely wrong. It'll be wrong in the specifics. But I'm absolutely clear that the modelling will give a very clear picture of the price that's available and it will be directionally correct, right? So will the answer for entity A be $800? Well, no. Will it be something between, say, 750 and 900? Yeah, absolutely. Assuming that the levels of investment are what they would appear to be in terms of what's required, and that the efficiencies are delivered. So here's the key message. The benefits of the reform are there, but they're not a given. They require great management, they require really clear governance, and they require really effective regulation. And I often refer to this as a three-legged stool. All three legs need to be effective. I've heard it said in the world of real estate that the key factors are location, location, and more location. But if New Zealand is to realise similar benefits to those that we've enjoyed in Scotland, then the three-legged stool is going to stay upright. And that means that information, information, and information is what's going to be important. There are no shortcuts here, much as many will likely want to convince you that there are. And please believe me, I've learned this the hard way. Anytime that I've sought to take a shortcut, notably in trying to harmonise business charges too quickly across Scotland, I've come a cropper. It would quite literally be impossible for me to overstress this point. Good information is the absolute foundation on which a reform programme will rest. It allows what has to be done to be defined in detail, to be measured clearly, to be reported on transparently, and for the whole sector, for all three legs of the stool, management, boards, regulators, to be held clearly to account. Good and consistent information will benefit all those that have an interest, politicians, national and local, communities and customers. And maybe it's stating the obvious, but accountability is only ever as good as the information that's reported and presented. In Scotland, we've been through 20 years of hard work, more hard work, and even more hard work, along with a sprinkling of cajoling, negotiation, learning from our mistakes, and adapting our expectations to further and better particulars. And I'd say to you, even after 20 years, there's no room for complacency. It's still full on. The shortcuts still look every bit as tempting as they did before, but like other temptations in life, they're never really a good idea. Another little Robert Burns thought for you. Dare to be honest and fear no labour. Indeed, I would go so far as to argue that from an economic regulator's perspective, collecting and analysing information is far more important even than the setting of prices, which is how most seem to describe the role of an economic regulator. So successful reform is a huge undertaking and one that in Scotland, I'll openly admit, has been difficult. It's all too easy to succumb to these temptations of shortcuts, particularly in the early years, and to underestimate the scale of the challenge. At first, Scottish Water had only incomplete and inconsistent information. I'm sorry to say that New Zealand, in this respect, you're in a pretty similar position as we were at the start of our journey. I get that that's not going to be a popular message. I do, right? I had to explain to Scots in 1999 that we were lagging far behind England. And that is not popular, I can assure you. But over the years, we've built up the information we collect through this annual return process, such that we collect what will seem to you and probably most in the three water sector in New Zealand to be vast amounts of information each year. But here's the challenge, right? If a board or a management can explain to me why I don't need to know something that I'm asking for, I'd happily delete it from my information request. I can tell you that every bit of information that we collect, we use. The information that we collect is very clearly defined, and as I said, we require commentaries. Gathering this consistent and accurate information is not easy, and it takes a number of iterations to get it as right as one might like it to get it. Indeed, in the early days, the three authorities had to have several attempts at providing the information for each of the first 2 or 3 years. I think 7 times in 2 years was the record. Is information difficult and time consuming to collect? Yeah, absolutely. Is it an essential prerequisite for a well-run and sustainable sector? Absolutely. So what do we actually do with it? First, we seek to understand what the regulated entity needs in terms of resources, what it is committing to deliver, its capital projects, its cost levels, its levels of service to customers, its levels of compliance with water and wastewater standards, who will pay what. This provides a clear baseline. Baselines are the prerequisite of effective economic regulation. Second, once we have that clear baseline, we seek to ensure that what has been committed to, what in other words customers have actually paid for, is really delivered. This involves regular scrutiny of the progress of each investment project through the stages of definition, start on site, output completion, and the achievement of the desired outcome. A regulated entity is charged not with spending a certain allowance for capital expenditure. Rather, it's charged with the delivery of specific agreed projects with desired outcomes within the financial envelope made available to it by its customers. As you'll doubtless have realised, we explore any variances between what was set out at the start of a planning period and the actual performance in some detail. We expect these variances to be explained and for there to be a clear plan about how they will be addressed. As such, economic regulation is a highly proactive role. It's not a question of setting prices and then quietly hibernating for the remainder of a period. It's through close performance monitoring made possible through this information that we ensure that the company sticks within its financial envelope, the hard budget constraint. Performance monitoring is what this is all about, right? We report back on the findings. There's two sides to this. The first is the ongoing dialogue that we will have with Scottish Water and its performance, right? The continual questioning, the poking and prodding. The second is publishing our detailed commentary on Scottish Water's performance in each year. These reports will cover areas such as investment, customer service, and costs and performance. And this is what allows for evidenced policy from government to be pursued. In our experience, it's this ongoing dialogue and the publishing of performance reports that is the principal force for improving performance. Now, this might all be seeming a bit complicated, a bit long-winded, and it's true it's not easy, and it's true that a regulated entity will probably argue that it's a bit of an undue burden, an expensive luxury or a distraction. I've heard all those stories before, but it's what is required for successful reform. As I said, we're not asking for anything an efficient entity doesn't need to operate effectively. Any good management or board should want to grasp the opportunity that's available. How did the Scottish Government view it? Well, Scottish Government initially agreed with industry that the information collection was an undue burden. However, it quite quickly changed its view when Scottish Water came asking for more money, having not made its efficiency targets in the first 2 or 3 years. And what about Scottish Water? Well, they've been through all the stages you might expect along the way: denial, anger, acceptance, such that they're now actually proponents of the approach. and they use regulatory information to evidence to themselves how they can improve their own performance. And it's no exaggeration, I don't think, to say that Scottish Water can put down its transformation into an information-centric entity to the improvement in its performance. So what does this mean for New Zealand? Well, the timetable from government in New Zealand is that the new entities will start trading on the 1st of July 2024. I think that's less than 31 months away. Scottish Water started trading about 29 months after I took up my role as an economic regulator and about 33 months after I was officially appointed. I can tell you those early months felt like a sprint, but in reality, it's been pretty much going at that pace ever since. So what I'd say is time's tight. It's very tight if the benefits are to be realised in the way that they could be. Early progress is going to need to be being made in improving the quality of information on assets, on performance levels and costs of operation. It's a huge job to understand what prices the new entities should charge, who should pay what and why, what the programme of capital projects should be, and what the profile of delivery should be. And all of that has to be baselined and monitorable. Boards, management, economic regulator, and government should all want this information, albeit they'll use it differently. First decisions will have to be taken on less than perfect information, but that doesn't excuse shortcuts. There has to be a process by which information gaps will be completed. Collecting all of this information in all its gory detail really is a critical building block in ensuring the sector realises its full potential. The new entities will need to establish excellent systems and processes for collecting and managing their information. Desired outcomes will need to be defined, systems and processes need to reflect those outcomes, and all of this can only be fed by good information. As such, the sector will need to understand what its information means and its implications for what an effective utility organisation will have to look like. The new entities will have to communicate clearly, logically, and consistently. And basically, evidencing performance will have to be fundamental to their DNA. And what if it doesn't happen? Well, falling short typically results in greater scrutiny, more challenge, and a loss of confidence in organisations, or in a board, or in the senior management, or possibly in all three. It allows the reform of Three Waters to be questioned, not maybe because the reform was wrong, although doubtless that's how many might present it, but because its implementation has been less than ideal. This has happened in several jurisdictions in Europe, even where, such as in the Republic of Ireland, there's a very, very capable and experienced economic regulator in place. So all three legs of the stool are really critical. It's the ebbs and flows of scrutiny, challenge, and confidence in an entity's performance that generate the dynamic pressure for efficiency. And in turn, it's this pressure for efficiency that ultimately brings better outcomes for customers, communities, and the environment. You might regard this intervention as rather gloomy, perhaps intimidating, perhaps unrealistic. I'm going to beg to differ, obviously. I think what I'm saying to you is just realism based on experience. There's a real need to build on the RFI and for the sector to work on its understanding of assets, costs, and performance. Frankly, it's a never-ending task. The potential benefits of successful reform are very real, but they do require a very resolute and a very determined focus. And as I said, there's no reason why New Zealand can't learn from our mistakes, just as we learned from mistakes that have been made in England. So I'd encourage you to grasp the net where you can and work as an industry however you chose to do that, and show the dedication that households, businesses and communities achieve the sorts of service that they need and deserve in New Zealand. So just a final thought. I asked you at the start what the furthest city airport from Edinburgh is in Scotland. A further clue, and you'll see it on the screen now. But the city, like Central Park in New York, has a statue of Robert Burns. It was founded by a nephew, or one of the founders of it was a nephew of our poet. And some of its street names are rather familiar sounding: Princess Street and Hanover Street. You seem to use a Gaelic name for it, Dunedin, but that's fine. It probably says that whether you agree with my prognosis on water or not, we share rather a lot. It feels apposite, therefore, to close with yet another little quote from Robert Burns and say, in the light of the COP conference in Glasgow last week and the need to improve water environment around the globe, now's the day, now's the hour. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. We've got a lot of questions coming in, so we've got 10 minutes, so I'll try and crack on through a few. My first one is, Auckland Mayor Phil Goff has said he doesn't want Aucklanders to be subsidising other areas with poor infrastructure under the proposed scheme. How significant do you think this level of cross-subsidisation might be? And do you have any insights from your Scottish experience?
Will there be cross subsidies in a country like New Zealand? Absolutely. You can't get away from having cross subsidies. There are cross subsidies within Auckland today. Some parts of Auckland will be much cheaper to supply than others. So you already have cross subsidies. You have cross subsidies from one end of the street and the other end of the street in the water sector, right? So they're just a reality. In very rural areas, the unit cost of water can be often 20, 30, 40 times higher than the unit cost in a very urban area. So the answer is, will there be cross subsidies? Yeah, absolutely. How big will they be? Well, the results are there to be seen in the result of the work they did for DIA.
Great, thanks, Alan. How do Scotland's environmental outcomes from stormwater and wastewater compare to New Zealand outcomes currently and to New Zealand standards? I don't know if you're familiar with that.
It's difficult to be specific because I don't. The standards are different. If you look at levels of consent on wastewater treatment works, typically they are quite considerably tighter in Europe than they are in New Zealand at the current time. And the evidence appears to be that those standards are not always met in New Zealand, whereas here they typically would be. The levels of river water quality, I think in Scotland today, we have about 80% of rivers are in what's classed as good status. So one of the top 2 bands under the European Union Water Framework Directive. So we're doing rather better than our friends to the south, where they're, I think, less than 15% in good status. But again, that's a function of our geography, that we're much more rural, so it is a bit easier for us than it is for them.
Yeah. Are you surprised by the reaction to the water reforms here?
No.
No.
Not in the slightest. I'd actually almost be surprised if there wasn't a reaction, because there sure as hell was a reaction here. I was called all sorts of things when I said how much worse. In Scotland, you can there are 2 crimes you commit in Scotland, right? One is saying that public is not doing as well as private, and the other is that Scotland's not doing as well as England, right? And here I was saying both. I was saying a public industry was doing worse than a private industry, and Scotland's industry was doing worse than England's industry. And everyone said, well, but our water tastes nice and London's water tastes horrible. True. Doesn't mean that it's better quality water.
Yeah. Did Scotland water face a huge infrastructure deficit as New Zealand is currently facing?
Yeah. When I was first appointed, I was told by the minister on my very first day, 1st of November 1999, that if we invested 2 billion New Zealand dollars in improving things, we'd have it cracked. Right. Now, this was despite the fact that we knew in England that they'd spent about 25 times that. All right, England's 10 times the size, so they should have been spending more. But that 2 billion compares with the 25 billion that I had in the slides. And over the next 20 years, we expect at the current level of efficiency to be investing something around another 60 billion New Zealand dollars.
Yeah. This is a very popular question. So in Scotland, 3 authorities were inefficient and improvements were only made after consolidation into one entity. How can DIA argue that 4 entities in New Zealand will work?
I think what happened in Scotland was that 3 entities were created. They were created not very cleverly, because the lines were drawn in a way that meant that the customers in the north of Scotland, which basically was about 60% of the country, the North Authority, were going to pay bills that were well over double what people in the Central Belt and the southern area of Scotland were going to pay. So politically, it became impossible to have 3 authorities. Right, so the merger into one was essentially because of just how unfair it was perceived to be that people in the north of Scotland were going to pay double what people in Glasgow and Edinburgh were going to pay. The second thing that happened was there was no economic regulation, so that the reform into Create 3 was implemented from 1996. And regulation only turned up with me in November 1999. And when it became clear what the gap was and what the price differential was, then the politicians thought it was sensible to have one, which it probably was. And the results have been pretty clear since. So what's important is that you get to a certain level of scale that allows you to be able to afford good management and effective systems and processes. And there's pretty clear evidence when you look at England, where you have a number of smaller water-only companies, that you need to be serving in excess of about 800,000 citizens to be able to get to the sort of minimum levels of economies of scale.
What impact did the Scottish reforms have on the companies working to construct and maintain Scotland's water infrastructure?
The supply chain, do you mean?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Well, levels of investment have, in cash spent terms, have more than doubled since 1999 in real terms. And in terms of actual physical output, have gone up by more than 4 times. So the supply chain now employs far more people than it did in the mid-1990s. And in fact, the reduction in headcount that there has been within Scottish Water since it was first created has been more than offset by additions to the supply chain. So what you've seen is a bit of a rebalancing, I guess, from Scottish Water to the supply chain, but overall far more jobs in the sector.
Great, thank you. What external factors were considered in the Scottish reform and how were they navigated? The reason I ask is because we are increasingly considering environmental impact and labour supply shortages in all areas of work, particularly infrastructure, as it is seen as an enabler for recovery from the pandemic.
I don't think there's an easy answer to that. I think what what I would say is that there's always a reason not to do things if you want to allow those reasons to become the factor that decides things. So there's a reason not to increase bills because people can't afford them this year. So let's try it again next year, and then there'll be a similar reason next year why it's not a good idea. There'll be reasons why it's not a good idea to have to upgrade a water treatment works in that community this year because something else happened in that community last year. So again, if you get into that, then it all gets quite complicated quite quickly. So you have to just be as effective as possible in terms of management. You have to take into account all these factors, obviously. So I'm not saying don't take them into account. I'm just saying that you have to have a very clear focus on what you're trying to deliver by when, and in explaining what you're doing to the customers and communities and the impact on them.
Great, thanks, Alan. I'll do one final question. At present, we have a proposed new water quality regulator, Taumata Awai. Would you see any issues with merging economic regulatory functions in with the new quality regulator?
As a point of principle, I wouldn't necessarily. And the reason that I say that is that in Belgium, for example, that is what's done. The water quality regulator also does economic regulation. The critical thing is, are you able to make the trade-offs? How do you make the trade-offs between an initiative on water quality that might, in pure economic terms, not necessarily look that clever? So it depends how you value the improvement in water quality. So that's where you could run into some degree of potential issue. But in principle, there's no particular reason why you can't do it institutionally the same. Now, whether legislation in New Zealand would allow for that to be the case is a completely different question, well outside my competence.
Great. Thanks, Alan. And I really appreciate your time here with us this morning. Thank you for doing this.
No worries.
Great.
Okay, you're very welcome. Hopefully have a good conference, the rest of you. Thanks. Bye.
Thanks. So thank you. That brings us to the end of the morning session for day 2 of Building Nations. We've heard from Susan Freeman-Green that LGNZ has made a deliberate decision to speak less in opposition and to be in a position to advocate more on behalf of the sector. Susan also highlighted the importance of thriving and inclusive democracy in meeting all of our wicked problems through waters, climate change, and the local government review, but also the pressure that wave after wave of proposals for fundamental change was putting on local government. Nanaya Mahuta made special mention of Infrastructure New Zealand's support of Three Waters reform and highlighted the massive costs involved and the benefits that new water entities would bring the benefit of scale, expertise, operational efficiencies, and greater financial ability, and a better deal for ratepayers. We were able to dig into greater detail with our DIA panel. In the local government reform panel, there was consensus that the current Three Waters arrangements aren't fit for purpose and that the case for change was well made. It highlighted the importance governance arrangements for the reforms will be to succeed. There was a really positive panel discussion on RMA reform and the key challenges and opportunities to be explored in the next stage of the reform of the RMA system. Key to this discussion was the importance of integration and an outcomes focus in the legislative arrangements. We know RMA can be a complex topic, so just reminding you that you can go back and review all of our sessions when the recordings are available later this evening. Alan Sutherland took us back in time to Scotland, providing some international context to our current water reforms, highlighting that successful reform is a huge undertaking and that the necessity of the three elements of management, governance and regulation working well to fully leverage the benefits of reform with no room for complacency as time goes on. There's also potential, he believes, for New Zealand to do a lot better than Scotland. So I hope you have enjoyed this morning's session. We'll see you back here at 1 p.m, where we'll turn our attention to future challenges and social outcomes. And we've got Noriko Wynn from Oricon, who's going to facilitate a panel with Francis Valentine, followed by a Q&A. So I'll see you then.